Hello, yo. Today I'm going to discuss with you something that's actually rather personal with me, and that is PTSD. It's a disorder that I got when I was 16 that I didn't realize was even a thing, and I was in my early 20s before I even realized that something was wrong. A lot of the stuff that I'd gone through up to that point I thought was, it's just life, you know. Now, first, basically better understand what PTSD is, the first thing we need to look at is the fight or flight mechanism within the brain hierarchy. That is, involving the prefrontal cortex, which is like the front of your mind, the amygdala, which is a little deeper, that's the emotional reactionary aspect of the mind, and the hippocampus, which is the logical transcribing center in the mind. Now, to better understand these, the prefrontal cortex, that is where your conscious mind resides, your sense of identity, definition, your name, all that stuff. That's in the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala is your emotions and your responses, your associations, all that. And the hippocampus is where your long-term memories are transcribed. Now, the amygdala does the emotional memories that are transcribed. The hippocampus does the analytical. And this distinction becomes important with PTSD. Now, when you deal with a fight or flight situation, what happens is you come across something going on that you have no conscious understanding or experience to know how to deal with it. You're just caught off guard. The conscious mind cannot react. It can only act based on known variables. Now, it can define unknown variables, but it needs observation to be able to do that. And that's where the fight or flight mechanism comes in. You're in this situation, there's actually a blood flow change in your brain where some of the blood is taken from the hippocampus and redirected to the amygdala. This allows the amygdala to temporarily override the prefrontal cortex, and your conscious mind kind of goes from the driver's seat to the passenger seat. The emotional mind takes over, reacts to whatever's going on. This creates new variables that the conscious mind, while observing, defines for future reference. And when the conscious mind is able to see that the situation is past, it corrects the blood flow, reasserts control, and takes over the driver's seat again. So the next time you encounter this situation, you now have a premise at which to act instead of being forced to react to it. That's also how we learn, as an interesting fact. If we did not have emotions, we could not learn new concepts. Yeah, that was an interesting one. So what happens with PTSD? Why is it so different? Well, the reason why it's so different is there's so much intensity to it. The blood draws too much. It overreacts. So much blood is drawn that instead of the conscious mind going to the passenger seat, it gets thrown in the back of the bus. The emotional mind takes over, but the conscious mind is not there able to observe what is going on. So it cannot, define these variables. So you go through the situation, and oftentimes there is a buildup that we're not even aware of at the time. For me, it was years dealing with a sense of abandonment, verbal and emotional abuse, all kinds of stuff like that set the platform, the vulnerability that the trigger event set off. And then the trigger event for me was the loss of a first love. That utter collapse within was so intense that I couldn't even process it. And for the next 24 hours, I had a constant flashback where I just kept reliving the same things over and over again. Which brings me to a lot of the symptoms of PTSD. You have some chronic and some that tend to be, for the most part, temporary, but that temporary can last a long time. And those are the nightmares, the flashbacks, and the associative responses. Now, the nightmares and flashbacks are basically two sides of the same coin. The conscious mind knows that the conscious mind needs this information. And it's trying to tell the conscious mind, hey, this is what happened, so you can fix it. That's the cycle. The problem comes in that the conscious mind works by title and definition. It has direct access to the senses of the body, sight, smell, taste, The subconscious doesn't. But it's too deeply recessed in the conscious. consciousness. But it gets the feed from the conscious mind. So where the conscious mind creates title and definition based on the reality of something, the emotional mind creates association and metaphor based on the indirect access to that information. It doesn't know the reality of fire, but it understands the sensation of warmth, and it can connect, aspects of warmth to, other ones. That's why, people enjoy partying at bonfires. You have the warmth of the fire, you have the warmth of the human interaction. The emotional mind only sees the warmth, and it connects the two. Hence why people enjoy spending time around fire. But anyway, what ends up happening is the emotional mind doesn't get the specifics of what happened. It only gets the impressions. So it has to convey back to the conscious mind through metaphor of what happened. So the conscious mind can know what happened, right? Well, the problem is the conscious mind doesn't know how to understand metaphors. It's a very literal construct. And when you deal with like a flashback or a nightmare, it basically causes you to relive what happened. Sometimes very specific, oftentimes with a theme. For me, it was a heavy theme in loss and abandonment, where I would just spend hours just having to relive this pain constantly. And consciously, it feels like you're under attack. It feels like you're having to relive it. And oftentimes it can be very hard to even see that you're not there anymore. Now, there are two particular, two particular strains of PTSD that I define as the passive and the aggressive strain. The aggressive strain is the one that is triggered by fear, because fear is very physically active. And that's the people that get out and they act out their flashbacks. They'll get a gun and they'll run the streets thinking they're someplace completely different. Because in their mind, they're back in that war or that situation that caused it. They're not even consciously where they physically are at the time. They're completely disconnected from reality. They're stuck in their emotional mind, consciously reacting to it. The passive is depression-based, which is the type that I had. So instead of physically acting out my flashbacks, my body would kind of shut down. I'd have that little falling feeling, and I would just kind of, where I'm at, just kind of sit or lay down, and like a Rolodex just get flashes in my head of like every memory and association to it, just slamming in with the full emotional content for hours. And then eventually it would stop, and then I'd have to reprocess all that emotion again. The nightmares, well, basically nightmares. For some people, it's about getting attacked. For me, it was about losing people. And I would just have to have dream after dream of that. So I dealt with that fun stuff for about 9 years before I realized that the nightmares and flashbacks, they weren't an attack. It was my body trying to heal. And you have to quit trying to fight against it. To step back and observe what's going on. That's what the conscious mind needs to do. It needs to not be in the middle of it, but acknowledge what's going on. That's how you get the nightmares and flashbacks to stop, to accept it, so the emotional mind quits feeling the need to try to force it on you. Keep in mind, the emotional mind works like a child. If it feels like it's getting ignored, it gets louder and louder. But if you acknowledge it, the proverbial kid is like, all right, cool. Somebody knew me today. I'm happy now, and they can move on. So some of the theories I have on how to properly deal with PTSD involve excitation of the hippocampus during immersion therapy. Now, this could be done with an ultron pulse or something to trigger that specific thing to stop all that attention from going straight back to the amygdala when you deal with these things. Because that's reinforcing the problem. It's reinforcing the need for the amygdala to keep telling the conscious mind what happened, because it keeps getting too much attention, too much blood with it. So you need to redirect that back to the hippocampus where it should be, into the prefrontal cortex. Now, there's a lot of cognitive tools you can use for this. Grounding, and not like go to your room, but where you make a point to focus on each sense. You find something you smell, something you feel, something you see, something you hear, something you taste. That helps to ground in the conscious mind and pull attention away from the emotional mind. And it can allow you to emotionally distance yourself from what's going on. You can also do stuff like, work with cognitive therapists to guide you through the process. And they can kind of keep you cognitively tethered to reality as opposed to just being stuck in the emotion of the moment. And over time, the nightmares and flashbacks do get easier. Once I made that, breakthrough and started actually acknowledging them instead of fighting against them, they started getting easier. They didn't happen as much, not quite as intense. After a while, I quit having the full memory aspect, and I would just get rushes of emotion for a little while. I called them emotional relapses, but they weren't reinforced by all the memories, so they weren't as intense. And eventually, even those, for the most part, went away. Every once in a while, I'll still get a little one, whatever. That's going to happen. It becomes such a profound part of who you are. You can never fully get rid of it. Also due to the level of trauma involved. Whenever an individual experiences a major amount of trauma, especially when they're younger, whenever they re-experience connections to that trauma, oftentimes they have the perspective they had at the same time. For me, a lot of it was when I was about 10 years old. So when I would find myself in a situation where I had to deal with some negative stuff, even now, I'm like 40 years old. I'm 220 pounds. I'm far from helpless. But at the initial onset, I would still feel like that 10-year-old little kid looking up at giants, And that's just how trauma works. And a lot of that with training and therapy, you can help to curb that impulse, to look in the mirror and remind yourself, I'm not that little kid anymore. I don't have to be a victim to the situation. I have the means and ability to defend myself. Whatever's relevant to the trauma. And that can also help to get past the trauma aspect, because there's always a lot of trauma with PTSD. That's, one of the post-traumatic stress disorder. There are certain elements that don't go away. Particularly the chronic stress. And oftentimes the associations you never fully get rid of. Like I have an association, a vulnerability to the sense of abandonment. And that affects me far more than it should. Hence why I tend to alienate myself more than anything else anymore to avoid connections, which is an issue I'm working on, but it's easier said than done. As to the chronic stress, the reason is the brain hierarchy changes with PTSD. Because the blood flow never properly goes back to the hippocampus. The hippocampus physically shrinks. That's why it gets so much harder to remember analytical information like names, numbers, things like that. It's less dominant. It's weaker. The amygdala continues getting the additional blood flow. It gets stronger. That's why things emotionally feel more intense. And it's harder to control your emotions. And if it's bad enough, basically you're permanent fight or flight. Anytime you're caught off guard at all, it doesn't have to be a threat or anything severe. Anytime something catches you off guard, your body reacts as if it's much more pronounced than what it is. We've all heard stories and possibly experienced, like with veterans, a car backfires, they hit the ground like they're getting shot at. Because the emotional mind has become so dominant within that hierarchy that it doesn't ask permission from the conscious mind to act. It just takes over. And where the stress anxiety comes in there is, consider a moment of fight or flight. Like say somebody walked up and just punched you in the nose for no reason. And for the first 5 seconds, everything in the world is so intense, so crisp, so detailed, so intense. And then it fades. And you go on with your day after the situation, whatever. With PTSD, that intensity never really leaves. The world becomes that intense. And it has its advantages. But it also has its disadvantages. Particularly, whether positive or negative. Once you reach a certain threshold of stimulation, it becomes stress. You'd be having the best day ever, but too much of it, and you just start feeling stressed. And you may not understand why. That's because stimulation, we have our limits. That also gets into the depression aspect of it, which I'll talk about next. So when you deal with the world being so intense, you're naturally going to build up stress very fast. But we can only release stress so quickly as well. So people with PTSD, and I know this, that's why I'm disabled, they get overwhelmed. because the stress builds up faster than they can let it go, and eventually it gets past the threshold for control. And then they just have to back off and get away from everything, and they lose their shit. Pardon my language. There's also a major depression element to it, just in general, even with the stress-based, the fear-based PTSD. Because the way depression works, as I've said in other videos, is you get accustomed to a certain level of stimulation. And when you find yourself at a lower level than that, you feel like you're missing something. You're longing. That's the essence of depression. And the farther you fall from your standard level of stimulation, the more depressed you feel. Now, with the intensity of that stress anxiety disorder, it's very easy to get accustomed to high levels of stimulation that are not realistically sustainable in everyday life. So you end up suffering from large amounts of depression as well. From personal experience, my approach to it was I limit my activity. I still get out and I still try to socialize to keep myself socialized so I can handle social interactions. For a while, I actually showed signs of agoraphobia. It got so bad, and I forced myself through that. I'm kind of a blunt object when it comes to me dealing with stuff like that. But a lot of people, they want to feed into this stimulation. I'm depressed, I'm going to go ride a roller coaster. That's a pretty drastic change from just walking down the street. Do little things. Go for walks. Make a point to get, time in the sun, the ultraviolet rays. Get some social interaction, but don't overdo it. Because if you overdo it, you're going to get overwhelmed. And that sense of overwhelm is going to become the standard at which you get accustomed to, and you're either going to be stressed beyond your means or depressed. You don't want to deal with those extremes. So you need to monitor your level of interaction, monitor your activities. Basically take it a conservative approach. Less is more. You still got to have some. We need those social interactions or we will get lost within our own minds. And particularly when it comes to somebody with PTSD or many other mental illnesses, our minds are not a very kind place. But anyway, if you have any questions, concerns, whatever, you're welcome to leave a comment. Like I said, I do try to get on here and check for comments and all that stuff. My channel is still really small, so I don't really get any, but, perhaps in time that'll change. Or because I'm a conservative, my channel will get erased. Either way, we'll find out, huh? So, y'all have a good day. And, like, subscribe, notification, all that stuff. I'm still not good at that. But I'll talk to y'all later.